Good afternoon. My name is David Solomon, and my job is to bring the man of the hour on the stage. And I have to say, it gives me great pleasure once again to introduce Alasdair MacIntyre to this afternoon's session of Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture's 19th annual conference. We're especially proud to recognize that Professor MacIntyre has given papers at all 19 of these conferences, including, including, I should say, the first conference in October of the year 2000. The theme of that conference, and many of you will remember it, I'm sure, was the slightly gloomy one, the culture of death. And Professor MacIntyre, we started at the bottom, as it were. Professor MacIntyre's keynote address was titled, appropriately enough, The Culture of Death. We got just to the point. Like virtually all of his lectures at the fall conferences, videos, I should say, of his talks will be found on the center's splendid website. They're here for almost all eternity. Things brightened up a bit in our second fall conference, which we entitled From Death to Life, also with a keynote address by Professor MacIntyre. And the sun finally shone brightly at our third conference, The Culture of Life, with Professor MacIntyre's presence dispersing all gloom. And we were happy to see that. I should say, he's indeed spoken more frequently than any other speaker at these conferences, and certainly, I think, more memorably. He has brilliantly and persuasively pursued an understanding of the modern condition from a neo-Aristotelian or Thomistic perspective, and has argued that Thomistic Aristotelianism, informed by Marx's insights, provides us with resources for constructing a contemporary politics and ethics which both enable and require us, in his own words, to act against modernity from within modernity. His insightful exploration of the roots of secularization and emotivist culture in modern history has influenced generations of students at Notre Dame and elsewhere, as well as the legions of those fortunate enough to come into contact with his books and lectures. He's the author of 30 books, including the influential quintet of books, After Virtue, his masterpiece, Whose Justice, Which Rationality, 3 rival versions of Moral Inquiry, and Dependent Rational Animals. His most recent book, published in 2016, Ethics and the Conflicts of Modernity, an essay on desire, practical reasoning, and narrative, may seem to bring his overall project to a kind of completion. One suspects, however, that more is coming, and I suspect we'll see some of what's coming today in this talk. We all hope so. Professor MacIntyre is a member of the American Philosophical Society and has served as president of the Eastern Division of the American Philosophical Association. He's also taught at Oxford, Princeton, Brandeis, Boston University, Wellesley, Vanderbilt, Duke, and the University of Notre Dame, where he was the John A. O'Brien Senior Research Professor in the Department of Philosophy. Although he retired from teaching in 2010, Professor MacIntyre remains domiciled at the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture, right across campus from where we are today, where he continues to write and to conduct his research as a senior research fellow at the Center for Contemporary Aristotelian Studies in Ethics and Politics, CASEP, at London Metropolitan University, and he's also served as a senior, as I said, distinguished research fellow at Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture. His lecture this afternoon is entitled Absences in Aquinas, Silences in Ireland. Please join me in welcoming him to the podium this afternoon. Thank you.
Three things before I begin. First, can you hear me? That is, if you can't hear me and you don't care, just sleep. But secondly, I thank David Solomon for his generous words. What he's really saying to you is, I just talk all the time, and sometimes it's at conferences. And thirdly, I want to apologize to anyone who's come here hoping to hear either about Solzhenitsyn or higher powers. I stuck in one reference to a higher power just to be respectable, but there's nothing else. What we can say at any particular time and place depends on what words there are in our vocabulary. What we can think depends on what concepts we possess. This paper is in part about the cultural and conceptual distance between Aquinas' 13th century Aristotelian and Parisian thought, its vocabulary and its concepts, and 21st century thinking in, among other places, Dublin and Galway. It's also, and at the same time, about the inability of the 21st century to learn from the 13th. I begin with a catalogue of thoughts, all too familiar to us 21st century thinkers, that Aquinas and his contemporaries were unable to entertain. Aquinas had, for example, no thoughts about religion as we understand it, for he had no word or words in either his Latin or his vernacular vocabulary that meant quite what our word religion means. He could indeed have found such a word in Arabic had he read the Quran. In medieval English, the earliest citation in the Oxford English Dictionary of the word religion, used to mean a particular system of faith and worship, is from the year 1300. For Aquinas, the Latin word religio was the name of a virtue, one defined by Cicero as consisting in, I quote, service and ceremonies offered to a higher nature that human beings call divine. But Aquinas makes it plain that it's only a virtue when directed towards God, the God who is, as he is. Aquinas was, of course, well aware of the beliefs and practices of Jews and Muslims, as well as of the beliefs in superior powers of pagans such as Cicero. What he and his culture lacked was anything like our concept of religion and our use of the word religion to refer to an indefinitely wide range of different and incompatible beliefs and practices concerning matters of ultimate concern, matters about which we take it that disagreement is rationally ineliminable. We're therefore able to argue, as Aquinas never does, about how far someone's religious commitments should be respected by others, just because they are, as Cécile Laborde has recently put it, integrity-protecting commitments. In such debates, Aquinas could not have participated, and this not only because of the limits to his vocabulary, for he knew of no way to characterize whatever it is that an agent's choices and actions presuppose about that agent's final end and final good, which does not already involve a judgment about how far that agent's conception of her or his final end and good is true or false. He has, that is, no way of thinking about beliefs and practices from some neutral or even as if neutral standpoint, some standpoints that treats their evaluation in terms of truth and falsity, rationality and irrationality, as for the moment at least irrelevant, something made possible for us by our past and present uses of the word religion. Secondly, Aquinas likewise had no thoughts about the state, for there were no 13th century word or words that meant what we mean when we speak of the state, not in Latin, not in the vernacular languages. It is at least the 15th century before lo Stato and l'État, are used in ways that foreshadow the modern use. When Aquinas speaks of political society, he uses the word civitas, following Augustine's Latin and translating Aristotle's Greek polis. Other words that he uses when speaking of political communities, such as populus and patria, are always to be understood as having application to the inhabitants of a polis. But the modern state, whatever it is not a polis. It has, especially as it developed from the 19th century onwards, become unlike all pre-modern forms of government in significant ways, both in what it is and in what, because of what it is, it cannot be. It imposes laws so long in written length that sometimes even legislators haven't read them. And it inculcates habits of thought required by those laws through its monopoly of legitimate coercive power on populations within well-defined and policed frontiers. It characteristically claims to rule in virtue of the consent of the governed, but both governing and governed are well aware that such consent is a fiction. It controls currency and it regulates trade. It provides education and other services to large, heterogeneous, and often shifting populations. It imposes taxation. It confronts its citizens as individuals who have varying interests and preferences, and its political debates are between parties, which are coalitions of interest groups and preference sharers. Individuals are taken to have rights, but what rights they have or should have is indefinitely debatable. And for all this, it from time to time invites its citizens to die on its behalf. The contrast with government, as Aristotle, Augustine, and Aquinas had understood it, is striking. For Aquinas, government functions well only insofar as it enables those over whom it rules to achieve or to move towards their common good. But the populations of modern states are not the kinds of population that can have a common good. They are too large and dispersed, too heterogeneous, too deprived of opportunity for shared communal reflection and deliberation, too uneducated in relevant respects. So, if contemporary local communities were to become aware of their common good and try to achieve it, they could often do so only in spite of the politics of the state to which they are subject. And if they were to try to achieve their common good through the politics of the state, whatever was achieved would not in fact be their common good. Contemporary politicians do indeed sometimes use the expression, the common good, in their speech-making, but this is just one more rhetorical device for advancing whatever interests and preferences they happen to represent. Thirdly, and perhaps now unsurprisingly, Aquinas also lacked anything like our contemporary conception of a right, let alone of natural rights as they came to be later conceived, that is, of rights belonging to individuals as such. The Latin word jus was then and is now used of norms governing relationships between individuals, as in the expression jus eundi, meaning a right of way. And of course, justice, on Aquinas' view, requires us to observe norms and to refrain from harming others in a variety of ways. So someone acts in accordance with jus if she or he exercises some power as justice requires. And we do indeed need so to act if we are to achieve our individual and common goods, but not because individuals have rights which we ought to respect. I pause to observe that I'm well aware that in saying this, I'm taking a controversial stance. But I've no doubt that in essentials, Michel Villet was right in concluding that nothing like our concept of a right is to be found in the High Middle Ages or earlier. Of course, what justice towards others requires, on Aquinas' view, is such that we can nowadays, if we so wish, speak of those others as having a right to be so treated. Thus, where the 20th century Catechism of the Catholic Church speaks of the right to life of every innocent human being, Aquinas insists that it's always contrary to justice to take the life of an innocent human being. Someone may ask, what then are we to say of human dignity? On Aquinas' view, we owe individuals recognition of and respect for their dignity only insofar as they are self-directed towards their final end. But, says Aquinas, and I quote, by sinning, a human being departs from the order of reason, and so falls from human dignity. I am then to respect you, but only insofar as you act as a rational agent acts. And here there is perhaps a significant difference from some commonplaces of contemporary church teaching. Keep in mind now that Aquinas takes his 13th century account of how individuals as rational agents are related to their individual and common goods, to their immediate and to their final ends, to hold of human beings in every century, no matter what kind of social and institutional order they inhabit. And consider, if he is right, as I believe that he is, the considerable difficulties that rational agents therefore confront if they happen to inhabit the kind of social and institutional order that we inhabit. For as rational agents, we need to deliberate together with others if we are to deliberate well. And the practical arguments that we advance to one another in the course of such deliberation will have to begin from premises about the shared goods at which we aim, goods both individual and common, premises that articulate or presuppose some shared conception of our common good and our common life. Take away any such shared conception, take away premises that articulate or presuppose it, and what were our conclusions must appear no longer as conclusions of reasoning, but instead as arbitrary and unfounded theses, especially to those who don't happen to share our particular preferences or interests. But the modes of debate and discussion afforded and allowed by the politics of the modern state characteristically preclude opportunity for the statement of any such shared conception, let alone for extended shared deliberation. They provide no place in its debates for appeal to a shared understanding of some common good, not only because they are the politics of societies that do in fact have no common good, but also because their modes of rhetoric and argumentation are of a quite different order. What then happens when key goods are at stake? Characteristically, debates become debates about rights. Consider just one example of how this transition from one kind of debate to another may take place. Any group that has developed a shared and detailed conception of their common good will have it at some point to ask and answer the question, what do we owe to the children of our particular society? Giving expression to a continuing concern for their flourishing, one to be translated into actions that secure that flourishing, physical, emotional, and intellectual, through family, school, work, and leisure, so that those children in turn become capable of caring for their society's common good. As part of this, adults owe them protection while still unborn, while infants, during the rest of their childhood and into adolescence. But if adults were to take care to keep children alive, yet at the same time did not actively work to ensure that they are well fed, have medical care, and are provided with the discipline of excellent schooling, those adults would both be and be seen to be morally questionable characters. Imagine the following scenario. I live on the coast of a dangerous sea, one where the victims of shipwreck from time to time struggle with great difficulty to swim ashore. Many of these would drown if I didn't use my skills to rescue them. But having done so, I walk away and leave them exhausted and helpless on the shore, so that they sometimes are crippled for the rest of their lives by their injuries. In so behaving, I make myself morally unintelligible. For what point could there be, I may be asked, in caring about whether they live or die, but not caring about what kind of life they then lead? Suppose that I were to reply in my defense that I'm a deeply religious person, and that I believe that God has commanded me to save lives that would otherwise be lost. All that I will achieve is that I will make it appear that God is as morally capricious and unintelligible as I am. Imagine now another scenario. Some group that once had educated its children into a substantive conception of their common good becomes absorbed into a modern society and acquires the habits of mind and speech which enable them to function successfully within modernity. Their politics is now the politics of modernity, but they retain from their past some convictions which they still defend in political debate. What they can no longer do, however, is to present those convictions as conclusions of arguments whose premises articulate or presuppose a shared conception of their common good, since such a conception is no longer shared by the participants in the debates in which they are called upon to defend their convictions. The political and legal contexts in modern societies in which the rights and wrongs of abortion, for example, are debated, are very different from those in which school funding is debated, and these again differ from the context in which what is at stake is the size of a minimum wage for a family or the financing of public transportation. Any stance on abortion must now be defended without reference to all these other issues. If then the convictions of such a group are not to appear arbitrary and unfounded, or rather if those convictions are not to be arbitrary and unfounded, they will have to support them by some alternative mode of reasoning. What mode of reasoning might that be? Characteristically, as I've already suggested, they will have to appeal to some right taken to be possessed by individuals as such. In the case of debates about abortion, a right to life. Equally characteristically, they will then find themselves confronted by some rival and incompatible claim about rights. In the case of abortion, by an appeal to what is taken to be a pregnant woman's right to make the relevant choices. And since there are no shared standards for deciding rationally between such rival claims about rights, what will ensue will be a barren dialogue of assertion and counter-assertion with no hope of identifying any common ground. The outcome of such debates is, of course, arbitrary. Whoever can summon up the larger number of votes wins. And if the outcome of the debate is legally binding, those who are defeated will find the will of the majority imposed upon them. But they will have no reason to acquiesce in that outcome, and as much reason as they ever had to reverse it. For what has been imposed was not justly imposed. By those debates, nothing is settled. Such debates can, of course, take very different forms. So, recurrently, the debate about abortion has been presented as a disagreement about personhood, about what characteristics a member of the human species must possess if she or he is to be accorded the status of a person. And as the debate has proceeded, the claims on each side have been elaborated with increasing philosophical sophistication, yet without any progress in persuading the adherents of one side of the rational superiority of their opponent's point of view. And this unsurprisingly, for the concept of a person just is the concept of a human being as somehow or other entitled to certain rights. And the defects of debates about personhood are the defects of all such debates about rights. To win in these debates is as bad as to lose, and the temptation to think otherwise is always a sign that one has been attracted by a doctrine that emerges and re-emerges throughout political history. Its classical statement is by Machiavelli, according to which what matters is to achieve some desired outcome, no matter how or by whom it is achieved, whether justly or unjustly. With that seductive doctrine, I can't engage here, and the time has come to take leave of imaginary scenarios and to return to contemporary realities, to contemporary Irish realities. In June 2018, the citizens of the Irish Republic voted in a referendum to remove from their constitution the clause forbidding abortion, with almost 2/3 of the electorate voting in favour in every county but one. so reversing a vote in 1983. There was a strong correlation between the age of a voter and the probability that that voter would vote as she or he did. By and large, the young voted yes. Almost as remarkable as the numbers was the evident pleasure taken in their victory by those who had campaigned for a yes vote. And this was not the first such referendum in Ireland. In August 2015, there had been a referendum on the permissibility of same-sex marriage. That referendum resulted from the deliberations between 2012 and 2014 of a convention on the Constitution, in which 66 randomly selected citizens and 33 members of the Irish Parliament had debated issues of constitutional reform. And that convention was in turn the outcome of a remarkable attempt to engage citizens in political deliberation by two political scientists, Jane Souter and David Farrell. What the convention itself, but even more the public response to its deliberations revealed, was a change of mind on many key issues in the years preceding and following the economic disaster of 2009. What caused this change? The first obvious and true answer is, of course, the increasing secularization of Ireland. In the census of 2011, 84% of those responding were self-identified Catholics, while by 2016, that figure had dropped to 78%. More importantly, by 2011, the number of those attending weekly Mass had dropped to 30%, and in Dublin to 14%. But when we speak of secularization, we're speaking of a loss of, or at least a change in religion as we understand it, and it's perhaps worth asking how we would characterize these changes if, like Aquinas, we had no word religion. Aquinas, I suggested earlier, would have characterized what we characterize as changes in religious commitments as changes in the relationship between the immediate goals of day-to-day activities and the final end towards which those activities are directed. And we too may find it illuminating to think of secularization in just these terms. Ireland had changed and is changing remarkably, especially in the last 8 years. It has prospered since the disastrous recession of 2009, as it has never done before. Last year, its growth rate was an astonishing 7%. Unemployment was at 6%, while in 2009 it had been 16%. The proportion of the labour force at work in jobs requiring high technical skills has continually increased. And so the gap between the kind of everyday life that many lead and the way in which they, and even more their parents, were brought up is striking. It's a gap that for many younger Irish people renders problematic the relationship between their own immediate ends and the conception of their ultimate end that was presupposed by that education. They no longer know how to make the connection, and they could only learn how to do so if they were instructed by insightful accounts of how to think about their individual and common goods. But they now inhabit a kind of society which, for reasons that I've already sketched, lacks the resources that it would need to provide such accounts. Yet it's only from an adequate conception of its common good that such a society is able to find good reasons for caring about the good of all and any of its children. Add to this that, as I emphasized earlier, that the prohibition of abortion, except in rare cases, is intelligible only as an expression of just such a general duty to treat all and any of our children with loving care. And the outcome of the Irish referendum becomes unsurprising, especially since the most prominent advocates for retaining the ban on abortion were, of course, the Catholic bishops and other representatives of the Church. But the greatest and most scandalous failures of the Catholic Church in Ireland, and of course not only in Ireland, have been its failures to care for children. This is a sad story with many episodes. There was an earlier period in which the Irish state handed over the care of orphans and of unmarried mothers and their children to religious orders, while providing too little money for their care, so that the death rates of such infants were several times higher than normal death rates, and the dead infants were buried in mass and unmarked graves. Speaking of this, Archbishop Dermot Martin has said that, I quote, "There was a level of brutality that emerged in the church." There was the occasion in 1951 when Archbishop McQuaid, a man with in other respects a genuine concern for the poor, declared that a scheme for providing health care for every mother and child, which involved no means test, was contrary to the moral law. There were the many episodes in which the sexual abuse of the young by priests went undisclosed and unpunished, and so continued, because bishops and others took their primary duty to be that of protecting the church's reputation. And all this was to be fully disclosed only by later government intervention. So that the Catholic Church's attitude has not just appeared to be one according to which abortion may be forbidden, but also that the further good of children is an object of quite inadequate concern, one where for long periods the maltreatment of children has been of no concern at all. This was certainly one cause, not only of the outcome of the referendum, but also more generally of Ireland's secularization. For it gave those who had to make up their minds about the relationship between their own immediate ends and their ultimate end an excellent reason for regarding the culture of the Church with deep suspicion, as we should all now regard it. For the moral offences of priests and bishops were not only failures of individuals in respect of sexual behaviour and in respect of honesty, they were failures made possible by a culture of false deference. Catholic defenders of the ban on abortion thus found themselves in the position that I characterised earlier, that is, of having to find grounds for that ban that were independent of any general duty of care towards children, let alone of any conception of such care as an essential constituent of any care for the common good. So the debate became, as it almost always does, one in which appeal to the rights of the unborn child was matched against an appeal to the rights of the pregnant woman to make her own choices, a debate in which, as always, the outcome had nothing to do with argument, since insofar as this was a debate about rights, there could be no good arguments on either side. What matters about those recent events in Ireland, I shall now be arguing, is in some key respects what was left unsaid. In social life, it's often not so much the speech, even the garrulous and angry speech, as the silences to which we need to attend, and this not only in Ireland. Our silences that may often go unnoticed, because when threatened by them, we start talking about something else. And that we are doing this, we conceal by a variety of conversational devices, by changing the subject, by making jokes, by inquiring after some absent friend. You can, that is, be talkative and silent at the same time. Talkative about this, silent about that. Talkative about this in order to be silent about that. So it was during the Irish referendum. So what was it about which the Irish were, and we too are, silent? I approach an answer to this question indirectly. We perhaps do well to begin by revisiting an episode from the Irish past. In 1729, Jonathan Swift, Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, published a short work entitled A Modest Proposal for Preventing the Children of Poor People from Being a Burthen to Their Parents and Country, and for Making Them Beneficial to the Public. 3 years earlier, Swift had published Gulliver's Travels, and as a result, there were many readers waiting to read whatever he published. So what was Swift's modest proposal? It was that the poor should not be just permitted, but encouraged, to bring up children until they were 1 year old, and then slaughter them, in order to provide meat for the tables of the rich. By so doing, the poor would provide income for themselves and delicacies for the rich, and their children would no longer grow up to be a burden on society. Swift has his own suggestions as to how infant humans should be prepared for the table, and he expresses his confidence that inventive cooks will provide further attractive recipes. Satirists speak as they do because if they spoke unsatirically, they would be ignored. Underlying Swift's satire is his quiet rage at the contemporary treatment of the Irish poor. Had he spoken unsatirically about that treatment, he would have left his readers as unmoved as they already were by moral speechifying. But by speaking as he does, he provokes questions that he himself didn't pose. Why do we so confidently treat Swift's proposal as satire? What is it in our attitudes and beliefs that prevents us from taking it seriously? Swift's target was, after all, a conception of utility that already in his own time informed a great deal of economic practice and that was soon to become central to economic theorizing. If we agree to treat human labor as a commodity, it's the shortest of steps to treat human laborers and future human laborers as commodities, only to be valued as they contribute to economic well-being. And if we have future laborers for whom the market will not be able to find employment, shouldn't we recognize that they'll be more valuable as sources of protein? So why is this mode of reasoning, so easily acceptable in some other contexts, so unacceptable in this? What Swift had hoped to communicate was that if we were to entertain seriously, even for a moment, his modest proposal, we should have lost any sense of our own good. What then is it about our good that makes that proposal so grossly unacceptable? The answer is that our specific good is the good of rational animals, each of whom has the potentiality of becoming a fully rational agent, and that we presuppose this in our activities and habits, even although it may be rarely that we have the conceptual resources to formulate it in our thoughts. If we are to achieve that specifically human good, then we have to treat each other as just such animals, as others to be fed by each other, not to be eaten. For without a strong sense of the needs of those others with whom we engage, their and our need not only to eat, but to eat together and to enjoy not only our food, but also our conversation, we will never develop those relationships that we must have if we are to achieve our common and individual goods and ends. It matters then that we are aware of each other as needy and vulnerable, and act towards each other as those from whom we have to learn both what it is to be in need and how to respond to need, rather than in economic terms. So it is that we not only have a duty to educate all our children, but a need to learn from them while educating them. Subtract these considerations from our practical consciousness, and as I've already suggested, we will be in the kind of moral wilderness that Swift envisaged, one in which almost anything may seem morally permissible. But is the message that Swift had hoped to communicate still relevant to us? Consider another example, closer in time and place. On June the 29th, 2018, in the United States District Court of Eastern Michigan, Judge Stephen Murphy dismissed a lawsuit brought by a number of students in Detroit's schools. Those students asserted that the schools in which they were taught were in slum-like conditions and, I quote, functionally incapable of delivering access to literacy. These assertions the judge did not dispute, and he also agreed that, I quote, when a child who could be taught to read goes untaught, the child suffers a lasting injury, and so does society. But it does not follow, he argued, that there is any right to literacy. The untaught child may have been harmed, but has not been wronged. We owe nothing to our children by way of literacy. Had the words that Judge Murphy uttered been intended by him as satire, as a wonderful parody of an American legal decision, so that astonished laughter burst out in court, we might have been tempted to compare him to Swift. But alas, this was no satire. We were not shocked by Murphy, as our forebears were by Swift, although we may note more happily that Judge Murphy's decision has been appealed, and even more happily still, that there are many American cities in which local coalitions have come together to address such problems, so that in Cincinnati, for example, there is now near universal preschool education. The care for the common good is local. Contrast a different kind of social order. Between the year 1000 and the year 1300, parts of Europe experienced remarkable economic growth among whose effects were increases in population, longer lives, and larger families. Horses had replaced oxen, new forms of harness had been invented, and the first blacksmiths made the first horseshoes. The heavy-wheeled plough was invented and put to work, and the three-field system of crop rotation was introduced. Water mills and mill races appeared. Trade increased, especially through travel by river and along seacoasts. Fairs flourished both for trade and for entertainment. Commercial partnerships in trading enterprises emerged, especially in seaports. Cities grew and flourished, parishes came into being, craftsmen and merchants organized themselves into guilds, cathedrals were built. The new travelers included traveling friars. Universities were invented. New kinds of entertainment came into being. A nun wrote plays. Upper-class men and women played chess. Apprentices to stonemasons in Paris and Oxford learned to carve gargoyles. New kinds of poetry were written. Unsurprisingly, in this changing economic and social environment, new questions were continually posed, some of them economic, questions about prices and property, questions that resulted in extended debate. Of these, some concern justice in pricing, some justice in the assertion of property rights. By the time that Aquinas made his contribution to the discussion of these issues, there had been more than 100 years of ongoing debate, and in the case of property rights at least, Aquinas gave expression to a consensus, one that extended from canon lawyers to theologians and from both to civil lawyers. What had been agreed was that property rights were to be respected only because and insofar as respect for those rights served the common goods of humankind. When gross need would not be met if those rights were respected, when, for example, someone would starve if they didn't take food that was the property of another, then by taking it, they did not wrong that other, and what they did was not theft. Justice requires that we pursue our ends so that each of us may achieve those common and individual goods that we need to achieve if we're to direct ourselves towards our final ends. What should be striking to us in these thinkers and in their society is a shared recognition that economic achievement is only a means to something else, to something that is a common good beyond the economic. They took it that we need economic growth so that more and more children can be nourished and educated. We too often take it that we need to provide children with an education, but primarily so that we may be able to put a skilled labor force to work. Yet at this point, there is no doubt that someone will want to interject to say indignantly that I'm able to praise the medieval past only by romanticizing it. Think, they will exclaim, of how relatively few children were educated in the Middle Ages. Remind yourself of the condition of women. Remember how hard the lives of peasants were. Imagine the bad smells and the lack of hygiene. And certainly, we should heed all those injunctions. But my point is a simple one. I'm not claiming that everything then went well, far from it, but only that things were getting impressively better, and not least because the standard by which needs were judged was that provided by shared conceptions of common goods and final ends, conceptions that can find little or no application in many aspects of our contemporary lives, just because of the ways in which modern states and economies structure and compartmentalize those lives. Here, then, are matters about which the Irish were silent in their public debates before the referendum. Here are matters about which we too are often silent when we debate public education, and in neither case unsurprisingly. For if we were to insist that we will only debate abortion or public education as a sequel to extended public debate about common goods and final ends, we would find few, if any, opportunities for debate, and few, if any, to debate with. It is, after all, a commonplace of our society that these are among the matters on which each individual has to find ways to make up her or his own mind, and then give expression to the convictions thus privately formed in her or his contribution to whatever debate she or he happens to choose to engage in. For those convictions will be accounted, in the modern sense, religious convictions. Yet at this point there's a possibility that the comparison with the European Middle Ages be misleading, for it might suggest that the reason why reflective agents in that time and place thought and acted in the light of shared conceptions of their common goods, their final ends, and the relationship between the purposes pursued in their everyday lives and those final ends, was that, like almost everyone else in their culture, they accepted the truths of the Christian revelation, as they certainly did. So why is this, even if true, misleading? Aquinas and those who thought like him in the 13th century, and of course not everyone did, took it that we were, if we were sufficiently reflective and not distracted by uneducated passions, able to grasp by the natural light of reason the nature of our individual and common goods, something of the character of that final end to which our actions are directed, and the rules and virtues that we need if our immediate ends are to be such as our final end requires. What revealed truths teach us is that we are to be judged as rational agents whose sinfulness has deprived us, by our own grievous fault, of our ability to move towards our final end without the gift of grace. But the shared resources of secular reason are such that we can still call upon them in public and private disputations about individual and common goods and how they are to be achieved. It is the lack of any sense of the need for the resources that we would have to have if we were to supply this in modern political societies. It's the lack of any sense of that need in the Ireland of the referendum that makes modern political societies in general, and Ireland in particular, so notably different from some European medieval societies, and leaves us unable to engage in systematic discussion of our common goods. So there was indeed that about which the Irish were unable to speak, about which they were notably silent before and during and since their referendum, namely their own political and social common good as rational agents. In this, of course, the Irish are not alone. Finally, we should ask, did Ireland have to develop as it did? Were there alternative paths into the modern world? The answer for some times and places is certainly yes. In December 1951, Father James MacIntyre, then curate on Irish-speaking Tory Island, who was moved by his bishop to Irish-speaking Glencolumkill in the southwest of Donegal. He found a dying community. The hard life imposed on small farmers ever since the famine had had many negative and debilitating results, among them a notably high emigration rate. 80% of the young people were now leaving for America as soon as they could, many of them bound for Chicago. Only 4 or 5 marriages a year took place. No one could imagine any future for the community. And Father MacIntyre made it his first task to catalogue the prerequisites for a viable future. Prerequisites that included running water and electricity for every home, paved roads, jobs, and above all, a will to act together as a community. The last of these was first exhibited when he persuaded his parish council to call upon the parishioners to build a community centre, something that surprised them a good deal, but that they had achieved by early in 1953 with increasing enthusiasm. It was to become in time a place for, I quote from Father MacIntyre, dances, dramas, and bazaars. But before that could happen, other problems had to be solved, and many of them were solved. An initial scheme for replacing individual farms by a cooperatively owned and administered farm won local support, but was frustrated by the refusal of government departments to approve a necessary loan. Other cooperative enterprises, however, flourished and supplied jobs. A collectively owned factory for canning vegetables grown on the farms, a hand knitting cooperative, and then a knitting factory, a holiday village, and an hotel. Electricity and piped water had been supplied, and in 1970 a development association was formed. Emigration was no longer the attractive alternative. So a local community began to flourish, and did flourish, in working hopefully for its common good. Individuals found goals and goods for themselves, and all this within the framework of the life of a parish. It's true that what Father MacIntyre threatened his parishioners with was not so much the prospect of hell as the prospect of Chicago. Although it's important to put on record the generous financial contribution made to his enterprise by some of those who had emigrated to Chicago. But the success of his and their enterprise was, it turned out, only to be temporary. There was a need for capital investment in its various projects that couldn't in the end be met. There was a need for managerial skills, but no one able to supply the necessary training. And so in the end, this shared directedness towards the common good was no longer to be found. This doesn't mean that Father MacIntyre's enterprise was a failure. Not only was it worthwhile in itself, but the 20 or more years during which it flourished in the most adverse circumstances provided just the example that we all of us need of a possibility that we're too apt to forget, that of the recovery of a conception of and a sense of their common good in a variety of local communities. Ireland needs to remember Father MacIntyre and Glencullenkill, and so do we.
Thank you very much, Professor MacIntyre. My name is Hayden from Columbia University. So you mentioned that this sort of debate about rights can easily become incommensurable. It can just a shouting match, sort of violent dialogue with no hope of common ground, and the outcome is arbitrary. In exactly what ways would a debate about common good be different? What are our grounds for hoping that there will be more common ground and that it will be more sort of cohesive well, that's one alternative. Do you just say that why would there be more common ground? Or do you think that all we need is a relatively vague notion of common good that we can all agree on? That's my question. Thank you.
Good. Let me say two things. First is this, that in general in modern societies, the identification of common goods, and even of something as ambitious as the common good of this particular group, begins with the identification of bad things that are happening. So in a particular community, people may find their schools are failing them. Why are their schools failing them? Well, they have a difficult task with the children because the children's home life doesn't prepare them for school. Why doesn't the children's home life prepare them for school? Well, the employment patterns are such that parents either have to travel a long distance in order to hold down a job and so can't spend time at home, or wages are so low or employment is so bad that the home has very meager resources. And so you find there's a problem about the school, there's a problem about the home, there's a problem about employment. And you're not going to be able to solve any one of these unless you're able to do something about the others. Different communities have done very well in the face of certain difficulties of this kind. I mentioned Cincinnati, where it was discovered that they had in their schools children who were failing to learn And why? Because they were badly prepared when they arrived in school, and so now Cincinnati has, as a result of the work of a political coalition working locally, near universal preschool schooling, kindergartens. And those kindergartens do things that we might expect in other communities' homes to do, but they don't. So what I'm saying is that when people find they have to work together on different local problems that actually affect them and their neighbors, then, although they may not use this vocabulary at all, they begin to understand that there is a common good at stake, and they deliberate together as to how they're to achieve the common good. That's the first thing to be said, and I hope it's clear. And it's precisely because it involves people deliberating together in the face of great difficulties and finding resources to overcome them, this becomes something that creates a community. When I gave the example, perhaps from too distant a time and place, of what happened under Father MacIntyre and Glen Columkill, it was precisely an example of a community which seemed without any hope at all, people coming together in the face of various difficulties and achieving something. So this is what makes a common good local, and there's nothing vague about it. It starts from very concrete considerations. The second thing one has to say is that, just as with Glen Columkill, whatever you achieve may always turn out to be undermined and threatened because of the structures of our society. Let me just take one thing that works against common goods, and that is simply mobility. If you're going to get on in our society, career-wise, you've got to be prepared to be mobile, to go wherever the kind of job that you are pursuing is, to take the kind of courses that you need for this particular ascent, and so you will find yourself moving about the country from institution to institution. And this at once means that family ties are weakened. It means that relatively few children have the experience of extended conversation, not just with parents, but with grandparents. And yet extended conversation with grandparents was in the past one of the things that enabled people to understand who they were and to relate to other members of their community. Now, mobility is only one such factor. We take this for granted. If you were to try to get rid of mobility as we have it, who knows what incredibly bad economic consequences would happen. But this is the kind of thing against which you're going to have to struggle.
Hello, Professor MacIntyre. My name is Donald Sheff. I'm from Michigan. Does the rebirth of community necessarily need to take place, or is it more ideal to take place on an island, so to speak? You spoke of an island, and there's been commentary, and or is there any imperative, or is there a duty that those communities ought to be built more in the city or in urban areas, I suppose?
Sorry, the reference to Torrey Island was purely incidental. That's where Father MacIntyre came from. There's nothing, about the common good and islands that I know of that connect them particularly together. I could talk to you for a long time, happily, about Torrey Island, which is a very remarkable place, but I'm not going to waste your time on that now. Obviously, for the vast majority of people in our society, if they are going to identify something like the common good and achievement, it's going to have to be in cities. And therefore, you're going to have to understand in urban life how things are. And one of the most interesting things in cities is the relationship between where people live and where they do their work, and how they are related to the people among whom they live, how they're related to the people among whom they work, and how these two are related. And if you want to look at some very, very interesting studies of this, then Chicago offers you, by the way, tremendous material for study. If you want to look at what happens on the south side of Chicago in the way of job opportunities, and one of the sad things about the south side of Chicago is that when people begin to improve their condition, they generally have to do so by moving away. And so one of the odd things you get is that one aspect of doing well and improving is you produce the very circumstances which means that things don't go so well later on.
Luke Foster from the University of Chicago, that hellish place.
Sorry.
So I just want to return to one of your earlier points about the difference between the modern concept of state and the ancient polis. It seems that at least in one crucial respect, perhaps in two, the nation state can do something of what the polis did. It's self-governing, or potentially, right? It's self-sufficient, fulfills that criterion, and it can also restrict mobility. And this, of course, has become recently very salient. So I just wanted to hear you tease out what are the crucial respects in which the nation state fails as a polis capable of achieving and even articulating a common good.
So, sorry, could you say, I couldn't quite hear that last sentence.
What are the crucial criteria for being a true polis by which the nation state falls short?
The crucial thing about the whole notion of the polis, you begin with Aristotle, and then we'll say a little bit about Aquinas in a moment. For Aristotle, the polis is a body in which citizens participate. And they participate in such a way that the polis will either be a democracy or an oligarchy or a tyranny. And Aristotle then talks about the ways in which it may develop into each of these and what will enable it to flourish and what will enable it not to flourish. When Aquinas takes over this notion, he already has interesting problems, because the communities in which people live and in which they are governed or govern themselves by that period in the Middle Ages are, of course, very, very different from the ancient world. But he can still look at what's going on in Italian cities or in Paris, what's going on in the countryside. And here again, it matters enormously that government is local. This comes out very well if you look at the France of Aquinas' time and indeed later. One of the things that made Louis IX regarded so notable a king of France was he sent out commissions to go to all the local agencies that provided justice and rule to inspect them and discover if they were being just or not. And members of these commissions included a Dominican friar. They had to be dispensed from the rule that normally forbade them to ride horses and do things like that. So we know quite a lot about what went on. But what you've got here is a society which is still essentially governed in a local way, though it's moving rather fast towards being something different. I hope that helps.
Sure. Thank you, first of all, for your lecture. My name is Johanna, and I'm from Christendom College. My question would be, do you think that there is some sort of inherent connection between the prevalence of rights language in our ethical debates and emotivism? For example, from what I know of the fight over the Eighth Amendment in Ireland, the Yes campaign, their primary strategy was to appeal both to rights language and to personal and very emotional arguments. So do you think there's some sort of inherent connection there? Do you think it's mere correlation? And if there is a connection...
Sorry, an inherent connection between, I couldn't quite grasp what?
The prevalence of emotional appeals in our ethical arguments and rights language.
And?
Rights language.
And it was the last phrase I couldn't hear. Rights language.
Rights language.
Sure.
So if you think that there might be an inherent connection between those two things, do you think beginning to frame our ethical arguments in terms of justice and the common good will help cure the trend of emotivism?
I think if we really wanted to look at what was happening, still is happening in Ireland, and in a similar way what's happening elsewhere, you'd have to bring in a lot of things, and there would be a lot of connections to be made, and some of them may be the kind of connection that you're talking about. Let me put it like this. If you belong to a society that has not very well off and which has suffered from various kinds of economic and social hardship, and then progress suddenly opens up, it becomes enormously attractive. you're able to achieve all sorts of things that apparently your parents and your grandparents would have wanted but couldn't achieve. And so at this point, you tend to take on the new world very happily and very uncritically. And you have indeed a very strong emotional investment in so doing. Your conception of who you are and what you're achieving and why this is so worthwhile is very much bound up with your leaving behind what was there in the past. And in this way, there may well be a strong connection between that in which people invest their emotions on the one hand and they're willing to take on this idiom of rights on the other. I mean, this idiom of rights is, after all, so pervasive. Remember, the United States is founded on it. And at this point, to make your way in the world and yet to be critical of the world in which we're trying to make our way is very difficult indeed. So I'm not being in the least harsh or critical of people at this point.
Yes, earlier you mentioned that mobility that we see nowadays is in part responsible for lack of a common good, and you talk about the medieval era as having a keen sense of that natural common good across generations. And I wonder how much of those two things are related, especially in contrast to our modern society. So in medieval era, you had your ancestors and your descendants all basically expecting the same polis, the same society to be there to identify with. And now that we have our modern mobility, where every generation is living in a different city practically, how can we expect a common good to develop within a community if the community itself is constantly changing across generations and there is no continuity whatsoever as far as identity?
I'm not sure that your question isn't itself an answer. I mean, that's to say, it's all too easy to describe the situation as though it follows that nothing can be done. And when I was writing my paper, I was very conscious that I might be falling into this mistake. And that's partly why I put in the passage at the end about Father MacIntyre and Glen Columkill. Because the lesson of that is not that Father MacIntyre provides us with a usable example in the sense of go and do what he did, but that here was a situation in which it would have been very easy to conclude, and almost everybody did conclude, that the situation was completely hopeless. And yet, it turned out not so. So when one looks at what goes on here, the contrast with medieval societies isn't really useful. I mean, it's worth making, but isn't helpful at all. Practically, you've got to look to yourself and ask, where do we find people doing things that are actually working? And this is why I cited Cincinnati, and there are a great many other cities, by the way, that have the same kind of local initiatives, and where people have worked together to tackle particular problems, and where very good things happen. And one of the interesting things is the contrast between the success of these local initiatives in so many different circumstances and the complete contrast with standard politics, where standard politics goes on as though this other world didn't exist, takes no notice of it at all. And that's very interesting. Thank you.
Professor MacIntyre, thank you for your talk. My name is John Paul Gennaro. I'm just wondering, do you think the debate on abortion is so entrenched in the discussion of rights and the endless cycle of assertion and counter-assertion, do you think it is even winnable at this point? And if not, then where do we go from there?
I think the single most important thing about the abortion discussion is that one should think about the longer run. I think that in many levels, the Right to Life movement has done well in helping to provide facilities for expectant mothers, in helping to provide support for young women who find themselves pregnant, all sorts of very good things. But in the end, this is a very barren and bitter debate. And it's a debate in which, in the long run, you're liable to lose. One of the things that is very impressive in Ireland is the way in which the change in attitudes has varied with age. So that if trends continue as they are, and people were to try to revive the debate about abortion in 10 years' time, they would lose more badly than they would now. Now, there are numerous signs that in the United States, this is happening slowly in the same way. That if you ask how people take various kinds of stand in various circumstances, you will find that the young are more and more likely to be the people who have become secularized, who think wholly in terms of rights and the like. And this is partly because of actual changes. When I first came to the University of Notre Dame, which was in 1990, not all that long ago, one of the things that I would invariably ask students when I met them in my office was, where do you come from? And I would then be told a story about where they came from, and very often a story about their families and how their family, we would talk about this and the way in which they were where they were now because of what their family had done. As time went on, when I asked people where they came from, I would be more likely to get a one-word answer, Miami, or Pittsburgh, or wherever it was, but without any sense that this was a question. I mean, this was a rather odd question for a professor to ask. And if I then started asking about background, family, it obviously seemed to people a little bit intrusive, but they were quite prepared to tell me. And characteristically, they knew much less about their family background and about where they had come from. And they were very attached indeed, even more attached perhaps than the earlier generations, to their immediate family, but they didn't have a social identity that extended beyond their own immediate relationships. My impression in the last 5 to 6 years when I've not been teaching, which may be at fault, is that now they are defined in key part by their cell phones. And that this is the continuation of a process that began a good deal earlier.
Thank you, Professor MacIntyre, for your talk. My name is Noelle Johnson, and I'm a junior here at Notre Dame. My question is, something that I've noticed being a part of the pro-life movement in the US is that rights language has ironically helped people, especially on the left, come around to the idea of human dignity for the unborn, especially as they try to extend protections to all sorts of different groups. So do you think that there's any way that the debate around rights for abortion is helpful, or could the language be resuscitated to reflect a more Thomistic understanding?
It's very clearly impossible to debate abortion in any level in our society without it being a question of rights. And you have to find your way to negotiate this vocabulary. It is important that much of what is said about rights can be translated into contentions about justice. And it's very important that the moment we start talking about justice, we raise broader issues than we do when we talk about rights, but issues in which there's much more opportunity for constructive and larger argument. So I am in favor, if I were to be involved in this simply tactically, I would want to engage with what people say about rights on their terms, but then try to transform the discussion into one about what justice requires in a community and what it requires for various people, including, but not exclusively, the unborn. Because I think that it is only in this perspective that a compelling case can be made.
Thank you.
Yes. Sure.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here, Professor. My name is Christopher Belmarez. I'm a Notre Dame Law School student. My question is, you talked about the contrast between standard politics and local initiatives, offering up Father MacIntyre's community example as something we should strive towards with the need for shared directedness towards the common good. With that being said, with the size of the United States and the amount of issues that face a federal government, do you believe that this is an argument for a stronger need for state sovereignty and for a greater drive towards states-focused politics so that way that we can find a more common good?
This is in a way an indirect answer to your question, and it's not going at it head on, but it's something very important to say. There are two huge issues that confront citizens of this country. One is quite simply the distribution of educational opportunity. So that there are all sorts of places in which if children go to school, they have very little prospect of becoming more than literate, and even places where they have practically no prospect of becoming really literate. And on the other hand, there are all parts of the education system in which people get splendidly educated in such a way that makes them eligible for going on to college and to distinguished colleges and so on. And this kind of gross inequality from the beginning deprives a large part of American citizenry of any kind of, first of all, of opportunity, but also they're deprived of the means of engaging in debate. They necessarily become silent, they sometimes become criminal, and they're forced into being inarticulate. If you're to remedy this, there has to be a huge change in how resources for education are distributed and in the kinds of resources that are made available. And if you don't do this, very bad things are about to happen. Secondly, this is an issue on which, if I went on for any length of time, I would have to become technical, and I won't. I don't have the time to do this. The issue of farm prices, the issue of how you structure the pricing, the supply chains from farms until supermarkets, so that in fact, farming becomes an attractive occupation, the decline of the family farm is reversed, farm laborers get adequately paid, and at the same time, food is sufficiently cheap in the supermarkets. So at the moment, the handling of farm prices is chaotic and irrational, and again, if nothing is done, something very bad will happen. Now, you might think that with two such sets of issues like these, in which the future of the society is at stake, during an election, candidates would have views on these things. But if you look at the television locally, you will find the candidates spend a great deal of time explaining that their rivals are liars, and none of them ever say anything about farm prices or about educational resources. And indeed, one has more than a suspicion that if you were to ask them about farm prices or educational resources, they wouldn't actually know what the issue was. So a society in which one of the apparent prerequisites for political office is being politically illiterate is a very peculiar society indeed. And I leave matters there.